Did you? Kate Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. Today's time for our Saturday book. This is video number 1 in our book, The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. I'm filming a little earlier than usual, and you wouldn't believe what I had to do to break up the sunlight over here. Completely washed out half my face. Anyway, you might wonder, why this book? It was written in 1997. Well, I have given this book, The Gift of Fear, to each of my daughters because it's such a useful book. Not all that much has changed. Statistics, yes, but the human psyche, no, since he wrote it. And in fact, I would love to have him to do an update, but that's for another time. And why talk about fear? We're trying to get away from that. And that would be why. When you hear what he has to say about it, it'll become apparent why we're going to concentrate on this book. And I think it's useful as a point of departure for the conversations we're going to have coming up in the next few weeks. So The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker, written in 1997, and it begins with the story of a woman who was attacked. I'll make it short. She was going up to the 4th floor apartment with too many bags of groceries to carry, so she was really burdened, and most of the way up the stairs, one of these buildings where the door locks behind you, and most of the way up the stairs, her bag ripped and all these cans and vegetables and stuff rolled down several flights of stairs. And she heard a man's voice at the bottom say, "Oh, don't worry, I've got him. I'm going to help." And this guy came up the stairs carrying her lost groceries. And he proceeded to insist on helping her, even though she got a bad vibe. He insisted on going into the apartment with her to put her things down. Things that he said to her we're going to get into later, all contributed to the fact that she let him in, although her instincts told her not to. She managed to talk herself out of it, talk herself out of listening to her gut, and she was attacked and would have been killed, except that she at least listened to that. Because after he had finished attacking her, he got up and turned the stereo on really, really loudly, and she realized he's trying to drown out the sounds of me screaming. Then he went into the kitchen and was rifling through the drawers, at which point she was able to take the opportunity to escape. So she consulted with Gavin de Becker, and from that story and many others like it, came this book, and he makes it very clear this is not about blaming victims. This is not telling people, well, you should have known this and you should not have done that. This is about teaching people, men and women, how to listen to their innate gift of fear. Listen to your intuition. It can save your life. You can be your own expert at predicting violence, and this book will tell you how. And one of the important things about this book is the freedom that it gives you, because once you read it and you learn how to recognize the signs of situations that are truly dangerous, you learn how to distinguish the instinct of fear and what to do about it rather than constant anxiety and worry. And there is a difference. It's very liberating. And in the book, he says you could be your own expert. You have an internal gift that warns you. And he quotes a lot of statistics. And in this book, he talks quite a bit about statistics, murder rates, violence rates, what they're really about. And the book's not a fear-mongering book. He's not trying to rev everybody up to be scared. It's the opposite. It's all about listen to your intuition. Pay attention to your gut. Here's what you're seeing and hearing, that your senses are taking in. This is how your gut's interpreting it. Don't ignore that. We've been socialized to ignore it. So he personalizes all of this. He says, you've known somebody, at least one person who's been abused, and you've seen the signs. Did you know you were seeing the signs? Probably not. He said women go to the emergency room with injuries from abuse more than the combination of accidents, robberies, and rapes combined, domestic violence, more than all those things combined. And he said, this is a loss for everybody. Murder victims are the result of all these people who do die. They're robbed of millions of years of contributions to society. And he emphasized that a lot of violent statistics are written to drive home this message, and it can happen to anybody, but we're in a real severe state of denial about it because people, for one thing, don't want to believe it's possible, and for the other thing, don't want to allow themselves to go down that rabbit hole. There's a third choice. He says, I've often said this, it's funny if it weren't so tragic. You'll see a tragedy and a community will get together and they'll be interviewed by the media, and they always say, well, these sorts of things don't happen here after that, just happened there. And it's that denial at play. So people in extreme denial who do experience violence have a worse time emotionally if you're in denial. So it's better to be aware of all of this and be adequately prepared to listen to your gut, because even if some inevitably bad thing happens, you'll have an easier time dealing with it afterwards. So this is to your advantage no matter what. And denial, he says, causes an unacknowledged low-grade state of anxiety. And that's what we're here to get rid of today. And you can kind of feel the same way about politics. This low-grade sense of, oh my God, the house is on fire and nobody's doing anything about it. Well, this gives you strategies even for that. And that's why I like this book. So what he said next is really intriguing given the profession he has. He said, our violence against each other is a great perversion of natural law. He said, we tend to improve the technology of conflict and not the prediction of it. So, bigger bombs to go after each other on a larger scale, and then on a personal scale, a can of mace that shoots farther. So he's writing in 1997 and he's predicting an increase at the time. He said that you're going to see more security at airports and in public places, and we're going to think that this is making us safe. And he says nothing could be farther than the truth. He says, what are the tools that we've been born with that we don't use or we don't listen to? We ignore them. Your biggest gift is your intuition, and it's often dismissed by the West because we worship logic and we deny intuition. And it's a gut feeling. Our most complex cognitive processes take place in our gut, not in our heads. And it connects us to the natural world, too. All these issues in this book are more metaphysical, and he points that out over and over, which just is kind of astounding. Anyway, he also solves anonymous harassment cases based on a victim's feelings. And he goes through the stories of why he did that. I tried to cut this a little short, but somebody will say, yeah, I've been getting these anonymous letters. We're thinking about putting our house on the market. We've talked about it with our friends. I've been getting these anonymous threats that we need to leave the neighborhood. Somebody has us pinpointed and casually mentions a friend of theirs that they told all this about. And the friend turns out to want to buy the house and want to get a cheap deal, and so sends anonymous letters to scare them into moving and selling their house. And he says often people recognize something sketchy. They bring these names up that seem so random, but then they immediately deny them, and his job is to be tuned into this. He doesn't believe in out of the blue. He says all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he just snapped. He says, no, there's almost always signs that human behavior can be predicted, and that we predict behavior while we're driving on the freeway. All those cars going so quickly, and split second reactions. We deal with human behavior when we're dealing with our children. When you're on a jury, when you're dealing with your spouse, with your boss, we're predicting human behavior in little tiny increments, micro incidents, all day long. And we can extrapolate from that to make our world feel less threatening, so we don't have to be in fear. Predicting violent behavior is actually less subtle than driving on the freeway and staying safe. He says violence is rarely random and senseless. It always has some kind of purpose, and there are always people who, in retrospect, prevented it or could have predicted it. Even if you're the victim of a public crime, mass shooting, somebody somewhere was fully aware of what was going on with this perpetrator and perhaps didn't recognize, or wasn't informed enough or trained enough to know what to look for, or talked him or herself out of believing what they were saying. So there are no monsters, and it helps when you see a perpetrator of a crime to look at their humanity, because that's how you learn to be able to predict the acts of other monsters. Unpredictability of violence is a comfortable myth, and it's a belief that therefore we have no duty to avoid or explore or anticipate future violence. It gets us off the hook. Oh, it's unpredictable. We couldn't have known. There are ways to tell. Not 100%. We're not blaming people bad things happen to. We're trying to nurture our ability to be safer. Every action is preceded by an impulse. Violence is the last thing he or she would ever do. You hear that all the time. My ex-husband, my husband going through a divorce is mad because of the money arrangement or the custody arrangement. He made some threats, but he'd never do that. And according to this book, you need to start paying more attention. He says there are things called pre-incident indicators. Everything you do is created twice. It starts as a thought. We know that, right? Thoughts are powerful. And then from that comes an act. And when someone threatens something out loud, it's it's a step towards an end. And if they present a weapon, it's another step towards an act. And he describes watching the moon shoot at his stepfather's house, and oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. It's been 2 months since I read this book again. He describes watching his mother shoot at his stepdad. Now it's all coming back to me. He had a very abusive growing up. And this is where he learned a lot of stuff. He learned as a child how to read people. And he said when they moved out of that house, there were 9 bullet holes in the walls and floor. This is the kind of environment he grew up in. He really learned how to judge, is this going to escalate or is this not going to escalate? He created a plan called Mosaic. It's an acronym. It's an assessment system. And it has gone on to evaluate threat levels of individuals against the Supreme Court, against senators, at schools, at businesses. The government uses it. He said he learned much from growing up at home as a child. Domestic violence of his stepfather hitting his mother became a system for the New York City cops to evaluate domestic violence because he consulted them. He taught them. He was growing up and living with fear, and that taught him how to manage fear, and now he's giving that to us. He and his company have helped governments, government agencies, celebrities, politicians, international corporations, religious leaders. They're able to predict human behavior in relationship to violence and safety, and they have learned how to systemize intuition, and that's what this book is. How to use your intuition, and then these are the next steps you take, and then you can stop worrying all the time. Over 20% or fewer homicides are committed by strangers. So what's that all about? So we have chapter 2, the technology of intuition. And it's interesting to read this book in light of the fact that they did not have email and 9/11 had not happened yet. Anyway, here's a quote from Joseph Campbell, the expert on myths. Technology is not going to save us. Our computers, our tools, our machines are not enough. We have to rely on our intuition, our true being. So he says the feeling is often really a cognitive process. It happens very quickly, and the brain is very inefficient. You are wired that when you sense a risk, you're wired to react. Intuition comes from the word tuere, to guard or protect in Latin. Often experts get too used to the familiar and they fail to notice signs. Experts like doctors and lawyers, police. So let's see here. The mind of the beginner is empty. It's a quote. I don't know why I wrote that down, but I like that. So intuition is a gift when it's heated. It's more valuable than just knowledge. I mean, your brain is helpful, but sometimes your gut senses things. We use judgment to talk ourselves into disregarding our intuition. The brain can override your gut. No animal reacts to fear by saying to himself, oh, it's probably nothing. So we ignore our survival instincts. That fear is a gift that our biology has given us to protect us in nature and interacting with other animals of our type as well as other stuff. And what's sillier, waiting for the next elevator or getting into a soundproof box with a stranger you have a bad feeling about? So we pay attention to risks out of our control, things like plane crashes and nuclear bombs, but we ignore risks that we can't control, like, put on your seatbelt and don't eat so much processed food and other things I won't mention because it's a touchy topic right now. Plane hijacks are rare, and at the time when this book was written, people were obsessing about it, but this is a sad comparison. Plane hijacks, which people worry about, are far more rare than infanticide, which is quite common. And at the time, he said people ignore it. I think our social attitudes towards some things have changed. In fact, I had to skip some of the stuff that he was talking about in relationship to domestic violence because things have improved. Not dramatically, but they have changed. So we love hindsight, he said. Media loves to rehash, and we ignore foresight. So the first thing he says is you need to listen to yourself. And there are things that we have going on in our lives that interfere with our intuition. And of course, the first one is denial. And the next one is misinformation. So, for example, people who think that a restraining order is going to protect you. Since a restraining order is a piece of paper, you may need to do it as a process legally, but you can't fool yourself into believing that this is protection. Chapter 3, the Academy of Prediction. It says it's no mystery in human behavior that we fellow humans can't solve in our heads and in our hearts. Evolution gave us introspection so that we can mull over things and model other human beings and therefore predict their behavior. We can sit and think, what would he do in that situation? Or what's he likely to do in that situation? We know what it's like to be a human, and we are naturally psychologists. And he says that violence, homicide occurs in all cultures. It's universal. We're survivors of 5 million years of the habit of lethal aggression against each other. He says we have space age times that we're living in with a Stone Age mind. says, your survival may depend on knowing that we're all human. We're all human, and you must be able and willing to recognize another fellow human's evil intent, as unthreatening and unprepossessing as they may appear. He looked like a nice guy. He acted like a nice guy. He was so clean, but he was the grocery clerk. He was the guy in the yard. He was my husband's friend. That those are the things we tell ourselves. Of course, he's safe. Surely somebody we know wouldn't do something bad like that. So we can accurately predict violence if we can recognize um, our sameness as humans, if we recognize humanity in each of us. He talks about a pet program at a Atascadero. Atascadero is the state mental hospital for the criminally insane in California. And he says that there's a compassion that we often ignore the humanness in each other, even in monsters. And he talked about their having a pet guinea pig and being devastated when it died. He says we ignore at our peril our common humanity. If we can accept this, it's going to help us to see the threat in an otherwise seemingly ordinary human being. Violence is committed by people who don't look or act like killers. Think of some unique, unimaginable thing that somebody could do, something unthinkable. Right now, try to think of something horrible that a human being might do. It's already been done. There's nothing that humans haven't already done. Rob Ressler, who literally wrote the book on psychopaths and killers, has a quote in here from Nietzsche. See if I can find it. And this is in reference to Silence of the Lambs, which he actually helped to make. His name of his book is Whoever Fights Monsters, and that's where the quote comes from. Nietzsche said, whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster, for when you look into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you. I like that. So the human predator doesn't wear a disguise that we can use to identify him. They don't wander around with the sign on them somewhere that says, I'm dangerous. People often say, well, he seemed like such a good neighbor. He says that's utterly meaningless. What rock solid fact, one for sure predictor of violence is your childhood. If you were raised in dysfunctional, abusive, or you witnessed violence in your family as a child or in your periphery as a child, serial killers, 100% of serial killers were abused as children. Whether or not the family denies it, when they dig into it, they discover abuse. And abuse can be neglect or humiliation, not just violence. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, nice middle-class family, highly intellectual, comfortable materially, good neighbors, nice people. But both of the brothers were social dropouts. The son David, who turned the Unabomber Ted, his brother, in, he dug a ditch in the desert and lived in a ditch for a few years. The neighbors said they were a good family. And Gavin Becker says, really? How would they know? What goes on behind closed doors? If you have one son who's the Unabomber and another son who lived in a ditch, it's not okay behavior. And he said there might even have been a genetic issue. But even if you have a genetic issue, as a child, there's a window of opportunity to intercede. We need to be more aware of that. And I think people are, in general, becoming more aware of that than they were in the 90s. One characteristic of criminals is that they are reckless, they're single-minded, they don't necessarily react emotionally to things the way other people would react. They often have a need for control because they probably grew up in a chaotic home and they didn't have consistency. Love in their home was probably conditional. And yeah, you can have 5 children in your family and only one of them turns out to be Ted Bundy. But that doesn't mean the others didn't experience the same sort of situation. The environment may have been the same, but perhaps their nature was different, or perhaps they had support from the outside that Bundy didn't have. People they learn how to become controlling because if you're growing up in an environment of unpredictability, you really develop behavior around predicting the unpredictable and controlling your life. And a childhood like this is a crime school. That's pretty much agreed upon. Many more people than you many more people than you would think come close to being murderers. Probably, even the best of us. um, and good people can do terrible things, but also make big contributions. So people are a mixed bag. Or you can commit violence because you learn violence and you learn that it's a way to solve issues. That's another huge problem. Chapter 4, Survival Signals. So this is getting into the meat of this. Quote, people should learn to see and so avoid all danger. Just as a wise man keeps away from mad dogs, so one should not make friends with evil men. The Buddha. So signals. So you run into a stranger, and one of the examples he used was this is just one of many examples. You're a woman alone going into a parking structure that's fairly deserted, and you're carrying something, box of something, and a stranger pops up and insists on helping you. This is called forced teaming. This is creating a we attitude that establishes premature trust. It's hard to rebuff that without feeling rude, and women especially are socialized to not be rude. And I cannot tell you. This happened not that long ago in my neighborhood. Walking along, minding my own business, I walked past a yard, and some old guy felt compelled to say to me, "Smile." And I looked like, what? And then I got mad because I didn't, you know, yeah, it's ridiculous. Anyway, forced teaming is creating this false sense of we. It's intentional and it's directed. And this may be an innate behavior on the part of somebody who is inherently a criminal, a psychopath, a user, a manipulator, a predator. So it's intentional, it's directed, it's creating a shared purpose where none exists. And the best cons make the victim want to participate in the situation. And he said, we need to learn as highly socialized members of our culture, we need to learn some strategies. And he said the simplest one, the very simplest defense is, quote, I didn't ask for your help and I don't want it. No apologies, no smiles, no explanations or excuses. I didn't ask for your help. I don't want it. And if the stranger is offended, he should have common sense. I mean, I think we've learned you don't get too friendly with strange children. I tend to be overly friendly with children because I've had a house full of children my whole entire life. And I've had to learn, you don't strike up a conversation with a child that you don't know on the street. And I've seen kids kind of look at me. I'll say, oh, that's cute. I like your tennis shoes. And they start backing up. And maybe it's me. I don't know. But the point is, this is a false sense of allegiance that doesn't exist, and people don't do it out of no motivation, and it's usually a nefarious motivation. And if they're just stupid like I am, and you're not picking up on social cues that you shouldn't be quite so friendly with strangers because it can be interpreted as a threat, then they need to learn that, and you're doing them a favor too. So it might seem rude, but it's a small cost for your safety. The appropriateness of your response is relative to behavior. For an example, the guy is getting the runaway groceries in our first example and insisting on helping. She should have said, I didn't ask for your help and I don't want it. And it would be an indication to him she's not such an easy mark. Rapport building is being done by this, and it can all often be predatory, self-serving. The next technique, okay, so forced teaming. You and I are going to deal with this problem. I'm going to help, whether you ask for it or not. The next signal is charm, niceness. And he says charm, it's almost always a directed ability with a motive. And this is so interesting. I love word origins. So charm is a verb, and it comes from the Latin canto, a song, where we get the word incantation or magic spell. It means to compel, to control, to allure. Charm is inherently deceptive. You're not born with charm. You create charm. You don't say to yourself, oh, he's so charming. Say to yourself, he's trying to charm me. So usually a person will use charm with a smile, which is the typical disguise used to mask emotions. And Becker says he often hears about attackers after the fact from the victim saying, oh, but he was so nice. He said, okay, niceness is not the same thing as goodness. It's a strategy of social interaction. So we have to start being smart about the way we interact with each other. Just because a stranger is nice to you doesn't mean that they have your best intentions at heart and that they are nice people. People seeking control use rapport building, charm, a deceptive smile, and unsolicited niceness to put down your guard. And it's especially hard for women to learn to rebuff unsolicited approaches. It's just really difficult. Women are socialized to respond to men and to be warm and open, to smile. And being friendly can encourage the wrong guy. And oftentimes he can get information from you. And he tells the story. I don't know if he tells it right here, but I'm remembering it. I'll tell you. He was on an airplane sitting next to a girl who looked like she was about 14, and there was another guy in the row in the middle. So Becker, the other guy, the girl. And this guy, Becker watched this unfold. He said it was just nefarious. This guy came in with no luggage on this flight and obviously wasn't a traveling businessman. And his comportment, his whole attitude, he proceeded to drink quite a bit. And he started ordering drinks and trying to get the girl to drink. And he was plying her with alcohol. And at the same time, trying to get information out of her, and he got quite a bit of information, including the fact that she took an earlier flight. She was landing a couple hours earlier than the people who were expecting her. There was nobody going to be there to pick her up. So this guy got up to go to the bathroom, and Becker leaned over and said, do you mind if I talk to you for a minute? And she was like, oh, okay. And he says, look, that guy is not a good guy. And if he offers you a ride, don't go with him. So we can only hope that it worked. She actually was grateful to him. She agreed with him. So women are socialized, against their better instincts. Someone who talks to you and has too many details, they're distracting you with details. Predators will distract. If you're telling the truth, you don't need to over-explain. Cops notice this. Somebody who's a criminal who's done something wrong will try to bamboozle you with way too much information. People are lying and they think they aren't being believed. So they keep talking and adding details. And it's used to distract you. Then he tells about a rape victim who lost sight of the fact that this guy who attacked her was a complete stranger because he was divulging all this information about himself. And she told, I think we're still talking about the woman in the stairway with the groceries, and she told him several times that she didn't need his help, but he kept talking and ignoring. And Becker says that's a red flag. If you tell somebody you don't want their help and they keep insisting, get yourself into a safe place, because that's a red flag. Then another strategy that they'll use to disarm you, he calls typecasting. Um, they'll say something like, you don't look like the type who ... or don't be too proud to ask for help. It's typecasting, telling you what you're like and it's not adequate and you're not being friendly enough. And this it always includes just a little tiny insult. And he said your best defense is to be silent and don't respond to comments like that. The other tactic that predators will use is called loan sharking, where they will put the victim in their debt. Let me give you help. And now you feel obligated. So this exploits the victim's sense of obligation and fair play. The next strategy is called the unsolicited promise. So if somebody says, oh, well, I'll just help you carry it in, and then I'll leave right away, I promise. That's a big red flag, because promises are a method of trying to convince people that you're telling the truth to them, and it indicates some sort of not obvious motive. He makes this promise because he sees you have doubt. And Becker doubt is a gift of your intuition. It's a second chance to avoid danger. First, you might feel a little fear, then you feel doubt, and we ignore it, we talk ourselves out of it. He says, always be suspicious of the unsolicited promise. If someone says, oh, well, get in the car, I'm going a couple of blocks and I can take you right past, I promise. Don't go. So when someone says, I promise, you say, in your head, not out loud, I'm hesitant about trusting you, and maybe with good reason. Thanks for pointing it out to me. You think that about them. The next strategy that they use to disarm you is discounting the word no, just not hearing it. Intentionally ignoring it. So if a guy ignores you when you say no, he's trying to control you, or he's refusing to give up control. So don't negotiate. No, he said. No is a complete sentence. Predators circle like sharks, and they look for likely victims. They look for signs of vulnerability. If somebody says, oh, let me help you with that, you don't say, it's okay, I've got it. They say, let me help you with that. You say, no, period. And it sends a signal you're not weak. You know, if you say, that's okay, I think I've got it, you leave a little door open. You just put your hand up and say, I don't want your help. It's clear, very, very clear. If you're alone and you need help, it's better to choose who to ask. Like if you need help out in public, don't wait for some predator to mark you as a victim. Ask somebody that looks like they're probably going to be safe, like a woman. With politeness, leave or do a really forceful no. Don't hang around and don't pussyfoot around about it. He said, women live in a state of wariness that men don't get. And I had this conversation with some guy, I can't remember now, recently, some man that I was talking to. And I was telling him, I don't think you understand. Women, when I go out on my walk, I have bear spray that shoots 80 feet. I have a whistle. I don't carry a pocket knife. I carry a small pair of scissors that's really sharp. I can't tell you how many pockets it's poked holes in. I carry a smaller can of mace in my other side of my pocket. I carry my phone. And I take occasion to work out a strategy and then use it. I was once doing hills, and at the top of the hill was a church, and I turned around in the church parking lot only to discover that a skeevy looking guy in a car had come around from the back end of the church, and nobody in sight anywhere. He pulls up to me and says, hey, you want to ride? I thought, oh, this can get weird pretty quickly. So I did this. I went, hang on a second. And I pulled up my phone and took a picture of his car, got the license plate in it. He took out so quickly. Like, what do you have to think about? Those sorts of strategies. When I go past a rural area with a couple of fields where the houses are few and far between, first thing I do is make sure I've got my phone on one side, and the other thing I do is make sure I have my hand on my can of spray, bear spray, with my finger on the trigger. I mean, come on, for a simple walk. It's terrible, but you kind of have to be prepared. So women live in this constant state of preparedness. And there's a great quote here. Men don't get this, right? This quote, I'm sure people have heard. Men are afraid that women will laugh at them, and women are afraid that men will kill them. Okay, some strategies is to keep your senses alert. He said, don't go out alone, walking and jogging with headphones on, which I do all the time, but I'm also so paranoid. He says, if you're concerned about a guy following you, turn around, stop where you are, turn around, stop, and stare at him. And the message you give him, and this is an expert on this stuff. He says the message you give him is, I'm not going to be your victim without putting up a fight. I'm not easy prey. He says you have some control over your accessibility as a victim. And for example, will you allow yourself to get pulled into an unwanted conversation? Can you be guilt tripped or feel obligated to be polite? Will you be strong and firm in your no? Will you honor your intuition? It said, what causes alarm, you probably should listen to. If your gut is telling you, oh, listen to it. Intuition is always something in response to something. We may not interpret it correctly, but it's very wise not to dismiss it. And it's wise to try to identify why you have this funny feeling. And don't talk yourself out of it. Intuition is always meaningful. It's the biggest signal that it sends is fear. He says, if you get a gut feeling that makes you afraid, always listen to it. Don't try to talk yourself into ignoring it or denying it. Don't tell yourself, he's a nice guy. Don't tell yourself, oh, that couldn't possibly happen. He said, how many animals tell themselves that? It just doesn't happen. So Becker talks about, okay, intuition talks to you through fear. And there are other messengers of intuition. And if you feel this list of things, something's going on. Right below fear, you'll feel maybe apprehension or suspicion, hesitation or doubt, a gut feeling or a hunch, curiosity or a nagging feeling, persistent thoughts about, I wonder. You might feel physical feelings, cold chill, the hair on your neck. You might start to wonder or feel anxiety. And one of the warnings, he said, that people need to be aware of when they're afraid and their body is not saying, hey, I'm afraid, what might come out instead is kind of a humor. And he talks about the Unabomber when a bomb came to an office in a box and there had been previous bombings and people were kind of on red alert. This bomb came to a university office and one of the guys, when they saw this box arrive, one of the guys says, oh, I'm getting out of here before the bomb goes off. Well, guess what? The bomb went off. So somebody says to you, I'll call you tomorrow if I haven't been shot. What is it that they're afraid of? What are they really worried about that they may be even not admitting to themselves? Dark humor is a communication of a concern. And it presents itself socially in a way that won't feel risky, that you'll feel foolish about it later. Cutter responses are dangerous. He says there's never a right way to respond to something. You need to, like when you're told, an example that he uses quite a bit is women suffering domestic violence who are told we'll get a restraining order. That's a cookie cutter response. You need to look at the individual case. So the next chapter is called Imperfect Strangers. And he said, people choose a babysitter with very little information. I think it has probably changed now. This is one of the situations that I think may have gotten better. But you don't ask them for a drug test. You don't do a breathalyzer. You don't contact all their references and make sure these are not their skeezy friends that they've given as references. You trust the reference person to be able to judge the ability of the sitter. Somebody will say, oh, I have the name of a babysitter. John says she's fine. Well, therefore she must be, right? Okay, so you say the appropriate response to looking into a babysitter is to sit the babysitter down and ask, have you ever mistreated a child? He says, we often don't see signs, and that doesn't mean there are no signs. Like if somebody comes in and pets your cat, and the dog is okay with her, you assume that she's not going to hurt your children. And he said something here that I forget exactly the context he put it into. But basically it was about getting into a ride company, a taxi. And I've often thought Ubers are really scary situations. I've never taken an Uber because, I'm quarantined, but I have nowhere to go. But I often think about that. You call an Uber. How do you know? They do checkups. They do background checks, but how good are they? How honest are the people? I don't know. I'm not making any allegations. I'm just saying there's a situation where you need to trust your gut. So when you look at someone to predict their behavior, remember, they're all people just like us. Predators don't look different. Try to find common ground to be able to see the situation that you're sharing, be able to see like what is he likely to be perceiving so that you can kind of figure out what their motivations and their behavior are. For example, he talks about some cases he's worked with where people were getting anonymous calls, and they were not threatening calls. They were intended to cause fear, and they were able to figure out who did it. And he said it was about somebody wanting attention, and it was a pathetic attempt. So Robert Hare wrote the book Without Conscience about psychopaths. And he said, remember, psychopaths don't perceive things the way we do. Their brains are different. And he talks about the Hare checklist. And I will be doing a special video on that coming up. So I'm not going to linger on it too long here, but it's a list of approximately, if I remember, 30, maybe 40 traits, behaviors, characteristics, and you score 1, 2, or 3, not very little, a lot, on a scale, and you add it all up, and above a certain score, you're probably a psychopath. So, but also it's important to remember that the Hare checklist, as it's called, was designed to study prisoners who were in prison for already committing criminal acts. So you got to take that into consideration. It says, but you don't need the checklist. We predict behavior all the time. For example, he says, you see a man arriving late at the airport. Predict what is he going to do? Is he going to just stroll cash? Or is he going to semi-run and hurry? So we think we can't predict violence because we aren't familiar with violence, but we do predict non-violent behavior, and we do it all the time, and it's the same process of prediction. So we recognize things by their opposites. We recognize it's daytime because it's not nighttime. You can look at somebody and say, well, these XYZ behaviors mean they're nonviolent or that they're violent. And he does talk how to suss that out. We know hot versus cold, day versus night. We can tell safety versus a hazard using the rule of opposites. And I don't think I'm going to go into this. Oh, it opened up right away. The rule of opposites, it's a predictive tool that they use to make predictions about people's behavior, and I won't belabor that, but you need to ask yourself, you can look at this chart in the book and ask yourself questions like, is he doing this willingly, or is he helping, or is he doing only so much and no more? Those sorts of questions. So it's a creative process, figuring this out. Creative people say the art is in them, and it was a process of discovering it, like Michelangelo about the statue to David. He said that he chipped on stone and took away everything that didn't look like David. So we can learn to listen to intuition. It's a creative process. The voice inside us, and if we do it early enough, we can act on it and be safer. Most people use what he calls the acronym RICE, R-I-C-E. Reliability, importance, cost, and effectiveness. And these factors are used to judge, okay, how much of a threat is it? How are we going to respond to the threat? And he says it's a little bit cold-blooded because, for example, the assassination of a president versus the assassination of a mayor. And we weigh the odds of what the potential is, and of course they're going to spend more money trying to protect the president than they are a mayor. So, for example, passengers are checked for weapons billions and billions of times, but only a few hundred are arrested at an airport in any given year. And you can be in a safe area, but you're still locking your doors. Those are calculated safety measures that we take. And sometimes we take safety measures when the risk is actually very small, and we ignore things like put on your seatbelt. Chapter 6, high stakes predictions. Women are more comfortable relying on their intuition than men are. Men don't like to guess and risk maybe being wrong. They don't like to ultimately make a wrong assumption. But intuition says beware, and we consciously predict behavior by reading signs, whether we know it or not. Body language communicates, and many gestures are global. You can do certain gestures and pretty much everybody all over the world knows what you mean. To predict violence, we need to understand some of the language involved, the language of rejection, entitlement, grandiosity, attention seeking, revenge, attachment, and identity seeking. And those things speak to us about a potential for violence if we pay attention to them. And the decision to be violent is based on, he says, 4 things. The first being perceived justification. Somebody who thinks they've got a reason. And that's not in the eye of the beholder. But somebody who has a chip on his shoulder, beware. The second decision to be violent can be based on perceived alternatives. Does he have a goal? What is his goal? Will violence achieve the goal easier than anything else or quicker than anything else? Excuse me. If he wants to if he wants to inflict physical violence, physical injury, there may not be another alternative to violence. So you have to kind of try to figure out what's this person's goal. Violence is most likely if the perpetrator sees no other alternative, and he'll commit violence even if it's not justified, if there's a goal in mind. The perpetrator also has to be able to perceive the consequences. You're more likely, they've done studies, young men are more likely to perpetrate violence in a group. If they're alone, they know that they stand out. The consequences might be greater, but if they're in a big group, they'll do things they would never do alone, like rioting, looting. And then the perpetrator has to perceive that he has the ability. Does he have a weapon? Will he be successful in committing his violent act if he goes? Is it worth the risk, basically? And this is pretty global. He talks about Palestinians because that was hot in the news then. But look at Putin in Ukraine. He feels justified. He doesn't think he has an alternative. He feels he'll have no consequences, and he has the ability, all in his mind, of course. But we have to look at him and figure out what is, what's going on there. Predicting Putin will continue until he admits he's not able to, or until consequences are so severe. Me saying this because that wasn't going on when the book was written. You can evaluate each of these steps by predictions. You can predict the predictions. So, is the outcome obvious? Looking at the potential for violence, is the outcome obvious? Are you in a position to even make that judgment? And it's sometimes easier to predict that something is going to happen soon, and it's harder to predict that a potential violent act might be happening later. Too many variables. So the imminence of the danger makes it more accurate to predict it. So is smoking going to kill you in 30 years? It may not seem important because it's not imminent. The context. So are you in a situation to even let you predict? Do you know enough? You have enough information? And then there's pre-incident indicators that we talked about. So if a guy is suddenly asking questions about the schedule of the public appearances of a politician, that's an indicator that this guy could be a problem. It talks about other comparable events. What's the likelihood? And we know about shootings, right? And objectivity, we can't be set on one outcome. We can't convince ourselves, oh, that could never happen. We have to be able to say, well, just about anything could potentially happen. And the other thing that will affect how we judge a situation is how much we care about the outcome. Do we really care? Are we, that guy looks like he might be breaking into that car. Do I care? I'm not saying you shouldn't care. And then, can you test to see if this is even possible for this to happen? And he said they work with a wide range of violent acts, and so this wouldn't be applicable in every situation. If the high stakes danger is what they're worried about, they can't mess around. They have to deal with it right away. And then knowledge is a big factor. This is why we're doing this book. If you have knowledge about ways to respond to behavior, what kind of behaviors are red flags, what to look for, then you can say to yourself, well, he doesn't fit the profile. That doesn't seem like there's an agenda, but it makes you more aware. For example, we know that there are signs of earthquakes happening, but they happen so far apart, and there's not much you can do about it. There's just, they haven't figured out a way to put that knowledge to any kind of useful use to predict. But indicators are really part of the crime, he said. For example, going out and getting a gun. That's part of the crime. So behaviors happen kind of in a chain. It's not just boom, it happened out of the blue. He says there's this build up to it. And so where in that chain do we address the problem? Violence is a process. So we're going to talk about that. How do we recognize this process and stop it before it goes too far? Okay, I'm going to stop here, and I'll be back for the next chapter in just a second.